uh, is it like the baby boomer guy photo or angry face
Is this
looking over at
on?
the screen, and yeah,
That's funny.
terrible. Um, I know I'm live right now. Let me adjust.
Oh yeah. Whoa, we are live. Whoops.
Just noticed that. I had a cloud, I guess, kind of pop up over the house.
Whoa.
Yeah, let's get into some of these scales and fretboard.
Yeah, definitely. Hang on. I'm gonna post this link to Facebook real quick. Oh, I had a Facebook page open. Let's look at that.
Yeah.
Man, Facebook, I opted into their like beta thing or their beta view or whatever.
Yeah.
Of like the new thing. It's like blowing my mind, man. It's crazy.
I get onto a single technology and then I write it until it's like in a grave somewhere, and then that's when I decide to jump on board any new technologies.
Yeah.
And I find I'm like 8 generations behind. Whatever.
That's beautiful.
I get really technologically hip for like a month or two, and then like I sink very quickly.
And then you're just like we're going down. I like it. Like you start drowning in all the technology. That's funny.
That's right. I tried to upgrade my studio recently because it's been forever since I've just upgraded equipment and upgraded software, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Even my damn operating system is like 3 behind, and so just getting into that whole sea of just what's compatible with what. And it's like, well, I'll live with what I have until I can't anymore, and then cry and then panic and then spin wings when I need to.
Right. That's too real. I had a buddy of mine called GAS, Gear Acquisition Syndrome. You just sort of like keep going. The pedal board can always be bigger.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you need more guitars usually. And so like
right. Okay, cool. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and start recording here. Actually,
sure.
All right, that should be good enough. Cool. Well, now to actually introduce everything, and if anybody's actually watching, I am here today with George Heathco. George is a guitarist around the Houston area. I'm trying to think, when did I first meet you playing at ETC?
Yeah, I believe 9 to 5. That was it.
Yeah, that's right. 9 to 5. Man, talk about a adventure of a show.
Yeah, that was I don't know that wild ride is what I call it, but it's there was a ride for sure.
Yeah, man. George and I kind of maintained contact ever since. We played a few shows after that. And George is, in addition to being a guitarist, an educator in the area as well. And today I'm just going to talk to George about some music theory, trying to get his thoughts on some things. So, George, how are you, man?
I'm hanging in there.
Right? Aren't we all? All right. Well, yeah, let's just kind of dig in here. So, like we talked about earlier, I was saying I tend to really think about scales in terms of like a fretboard, and shapes and patterns. And that's how I've sort of always thought about these things. It's only been in the past, I don't know, maybe really, 5 or 6 years that I've been thinking in terms of like, the keyboard, for instance, or like thinking about like the shapes that these scales and notes make on a staff. That's been a really relatively new concept for me. And I think that you were saying that you have a similar but slightly different view of those things. Would you care to express your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I was telling you earlier, I was like, I kind of view them as 2 different ways, and then I gave you a third way that I tend to think of stuff. But
whoa.
When I started learning music, trumpet was my first instrument, and so being a wind instrument, we only had one note at a time that we could play. And everything I thought of was always in terms of like from low to high. And so notes on a scale or a staff or whatever just always appeared to me as some sort of vertical placement, And so when I think of like a scale, or I think about like a chord or a pattern, or when I thought about it for a long time, it would just be like a series of like trumpet fingerings, getting notes to kind of rise and lower, and things like half steps and all of that. It was all on a vertical thing, pattern.
Yeah, right.
Also, being a guitar player, though, it's like my mindset has shifted a little bit more. Instead of thinking up and down, in terms of high to low, I tend to now think about notes a little bit more horizontally on a fretboard.
Yeah,
but it's interesting. I was going to say, it was interesting on that one because I think, as I mentioned earlier, I haven't played trumpet in like we're approaching 2 decades. In some sense of the word. And it's only been likewise in the past 5 years, I think, that my brain has finally decided to shut off trumpet mode and realize that I was also a guitar player. So there's that. And then the third way of kind of thinking about things is just in relation to piano roll and MIDI. That's kind of the other visual element, which, if you think about it, is really not too dissimilar from the kind of vertical trumpet thinking. But then there's also like the horizontal, like rhythmic element.
See, what I like about that is, it's this sort of like X and Y kind of thing, and your sort of your vertical axis is kind of like pitch, and your horizontal axis is time, right? And like pitch just exists in time, right? Now, one of the coolest things I think that exists about music, right, is that we can actually, like, once we understand that those two dimensions of it exist, we can start adding like more dimensions, like timbre and dynamic and just all these other different little nuances of music that just make it so much more than just notes on a page or data,
Oh yeah. Well, so I always tell students that, it's like the starting point for any musician, that like your starting point in terms of usefulness, it really begins only when you have that X and Y taken care of. Like, if you don't have that, then none of those other dimensions really kind of make as much sense. And so
right.
We start with, when I do end up teaching stuff that's on the staff, which, I teach a lot of guitarists, I teach a lot of folks that have zero musical background, but they're in high school or maybe early, college ages. And so maybe staff reading isn't the most important thing for them. But I do, when I do teach the staff, it's, this is essentially a grid, you're thinking X and Y type of things. And that's why I love that piano roll kind of visualization, because it quite literally is that X, Y, point. And the fact that you press play and it moves across the screen linearly, it definitely drives home exactly what you can think about with music,
Yeah, right.
Before you get to those other dimensions, the dynamic and timbre and density levels and all that sort of stuff.
Right. Yeah, man. And what you said about having that sort of X and Y axis taken care of, it's like you have to have that understanding first of like just knowing that it's like pitch exists and pitch exists through time, and like once you have that understanding down, then it's like the possibilities from there are limitless. It's beautiful, man. And it just sort of takes that basic understanding of like pitch and rhythm, right? So I mean, speaking of like pitch and rhythm and whatnot, these are just ways of organizing sort of all this sound, right? Rhythm is how we organize it in time, I want to talk a little bit about just like scales and patterns, right? And now I mentioned earlier that I always thought of scales like on a fretboard when I was first learning this stuff. So, you just talked about scales as being the sort of like pattern from high to low, and now recently being the sort of like on a string kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Now that is a little bit different than rhythm in a sense, like thinking
exactly,
of pitch from here to here, but it's also in a way
like my pitch element literally just kind of fell over.
yeah, right.
System, that's all it is.
That's funny. But I mean, it isn't in a way though. It's like, you know, Guitar Hero, right? Like, if you're thinking about like the MIDI roll kind of thing, you know, it's like the line just shifts across the screen, right? But like in that sort of like fretboard land, you know, it's like, okay, you know, like we got to hit at this time at this point, you know, we got to just got to get to there. But one thing that Victor Wooten would all like say at like the lectures and stuff is like, you know, you just got to put your hands in the right spot at the right time and just play the note, you know, like that's it, right? That's it.
Yeah. Just play the right sound at the right time, and
yeah,
you'll get hired. It's great.
That's it, right? Exactly. And it's like, man, you know, at the end of the day, it's like that really is kind of it, right? But I digress.
Well, so how complicated it is, you know, because that's such a simple concept. Make the right sound at the right time, you know, and then we overcomplicate, like what is the sound exactly?
Yeah, right.
Black arrays, and then we go, well, sound is pitch, and we got scale, and so now there's harmonies and tendency tones.
Right. So all of these different things, though, you know, it's like, okay, once we establish the fact that we have a sound, right, and it can move, like we can play sound in time, you know, well, we can organize that sound, right? So, you know, we've organized sound in scales. You know, we have all these different ways of thinking about scales, right? You have like solfege, for instance, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing as, you know, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, right? Or any other major collection of scales or major scale collection on a note, right. You know? And once you like can organize scales in that pattern, you know, like, well, they're just things that sort of appear naturally in that scale. You know, for instance, like the leading tone, right, of a scale. It has this tendency to sort of go up, you know, take us back to the tonic note. But there are other tendency tones in that scale. I think one of the more interesting ones is like fa, for instance.
Yeah.
There's a really cool, I think, relationship between mi and fa, you know. Now, just so what are sort of your thoughts, I guess, on these tendency tones? You know, this is a concept that I've actually been revisiting. It's something I learned really early on and then just kind of never thought about for a while.
Yeah.
And, you know, in the course of doing these talks, someone brought it up and like, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Man, I forgot about that. And so like, I've just kind of been revisiting this idea now. Anyway, so like, what are your thoughts on that sort of stuff?
They're kind of jumbled, so bear with me here. But
yeah.
I kind of feel like, so tendency tones to me is just all about within a scale, how are you mitigating the half steps? You know, and whether we're talking about a major scale, a minor scale, or let's just say like Lydian mode, or, you know, Dorian mode, or any kind of like modal type of thing, all we're really talking about is just changing the placement of the half steps, you know, of a scale. And that's ultimately that's kind of how we utilize them, at least in a lot of Western harmony. It's just those half steps. And so the tendency tones and just understanding them is just really understanding within a key or within a structure, like where are we going to place those half steps within this key? And then off of those half steps, how are those going to actually give us the sound of our scale? And so if we take like the major scale, for instance, the half steps, you're saying T and Fa. Well, it's like, cool. T moves up. There's that like rising kind of feel that gives you. That's the tendency of that half step. The other half step is a sinking feeling, you know? And so understanding that like tendency, like essentially gives, I think what I mentioned to you, gravitational pull or magnetism within a scale. And it kind of allows you to figure out like where in the scale does it really want to shift towards to where it feels most resolute, you know? And so thinking about it as just an ever-changing rising or lowering of half step, like that's my concept of tendency tones. Like things will tend towards their natural gravitational pull, you know?
Right. So, you know, those are tendency tones kind of in a major scale, right? Now, sure. One thing that I've talked about my class a lot is the quality of like a major scale. You know, it's a major scale, right? It has a major quality to it.
Yeah.
And the third is really important in sort of determining that quality. You know, Now, one thing that I think is really interesting about this is that in the major scale, right, fa has a tendency to want to go down to mi, right?
Mhm.
And this exists more. I mean, it sort of exists in that minor mode, but like this really has a strong pull for that major scale, that major sound, uh, and like T, that leading tone, wanting to go back up to do, you know, that's really important also, man. And something that is really, I think, integral for just young musicians to understand is that the concept of like a key signature, you know, that collection of notes and harmony inside of that notes, is that like each of these different tones in the scale, right, has a tendency, right, and we can create harmony based on those different tones, right? So for instance, the idea of a triad, right? A triad being 3 notes, right? Specifically 3 notes, sort of where you skip one note, right? You have a note, skip a note, add the next note, right? So in a C major setting, you get the note C, skip a note, E, skip a note, and then G, right? So you get a triad, a collection of 3 notes. Now, my class has been arpeggiating these triads, and that essentially is a tonic chord, right? Do you ever talk about the sort of names of the scale degrees, right? Like tonic, supertonic, median, that sort of thing.
Median and all that. I'll get into that for the most part. I think I then focus mostly on like the leading tone. I'll focus on the dominant pitch and then the tonic pitch. Like median, submedian, or supertonic, you know, subdominant. Subdominant I'll get into because I think that's useful for when it does eventually like.
Right. I would like to point out that my class, we call it the predominant, but it has multiple names. You know, like subdominant is a valid name for that because it is the subdominant, right?
Yeah,
it's one below dominant, right? It is just like 2 is the supertonic, right? It is 1 above tonic. So that's sort of like where these names come from. And, you know, I think it's really interesting how different theory book and different theorists just have different names all for the same idea, right?
Well, think about subdominant. Like if you think about like what the median actually is, the median is on the like in between the 1 and the 5, right? And so it's kind of the above side.
Right.
The 4 is actually a fifth below, right? And
right.
So that submedian and subdominant is kind of thinking about things like just on opposite ends of, you know, of like
right. You're sort of talking about that those 2 like tetrachords that are kind of like smashed together. Yeah. We've talked a little bit about that in my class. I think that's a really cool way of thinking about it also, like the 2 sort of interlocking tetrachords, you know, and that creates your like spectrum of pitch basically. It's a really cool way of like organizing all of this stuff, you know. Something I think is, I guess, as like a maybe just a symptomatic topic of all of this is like, you know, being able to organize like pitch in terms of like these 12 tones, you know, I think that's just kind of phenomenal in a way. But like, you know, having just this standardized system that it's like, okay, like that, like we get these 12, right? And you create music based on these 12 pitches, you know, and they're all equally spaced, right? I don't know. It's a really interesting thing, man. Like one of the last lectures that I sort of, not lecture, but talks that I had, you know, we talked about like microtonal organizations of like scales and stuff. And it was like, this is like really interesting, but
so many caveats to that. Same thing with the 12-tone thing. You know, it's like I got really into Paul Hindemith's writings for a while.
Oh, yeah.
And anybody who gets sucked into that gets into the inevitable like order of 12 pitches in terms of like you know, just dissonance levels or closeness towards the tonic, or you know, they organize intervals by dissonance and everything, and some of that stuff's just so interesting. I think he really hit on something on there that is has remained super useful for me as a composer and a musician in terms of thinking about like how close I happen to be to a tonic or whatever.
Sure.
But yeah, it's like that the idea of like just all right, all 12 tones are useful at any given moment, depending on
Right.
depending on how cool you actually are. Like if you could actually make that one note really fit, that's what it is.
Right. How thick can you make it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool when you start getting into like those different types of 12 tone collections, So like the Ludoslavsky sort of like how you organize the tones in a harmonic setting, like different organizations of all 12 tones all at once, and how they just have different like qualities about them, and it's like, whoa, music gets really weird.
It is, yeah. Well, like so we were discussing like the major scale and those like particular functions within them. I think that's
Right.
kind of interesting that it's like the major scale is just 7 pitches. We just somehow stumbled upon over trial and error and lots of lots of going back and forth, and in a lot of cases some math and all sorts of things. But it's amazing that within that 7-note structure, you have kind of the basis for how you would work with all 12 pitches based off of those tendency tones, right? Like where you place your half steps. We've talked about all these things, in relation to the major scale, but as soon as you throw a minor scale out there, fa going to May is going to have a different feel. But then we have lay going down to so. And so we now have like new sets of tendencies within the scale, and that's just, again, if you were to overlay like the minor scale on top of the major scale, you start to find some of these like other 12 tones you kind of mixing in there. And again, it's all about handling that tendency of pitches, and I feel like that half step is really the perfect vehicle for that, which really kind of gets down to kind of going back to the idea of visualizing the fretboard and things. Or looking at a piano roll, or even just thinking about notes, in terms of relative highness or lowness. For me, it's always about like first things first in a scale. Let's learn where the half steps are, because if you know where the half steps are, everything's a whole step,
Right.
Or at least as far as major scale goes. Figure out these half steps, find out how far the half steps are actually apart from each other. Fa and mi is a really good half step, and like how many steps away from ti to do if you ascend, how many steps from ti to do if you descend, and kind of visualizing it that way, either on the neck. I tried on a keyboard. It's funny, it's like keyboards actually kind of take away some of my abilities to really see half steps really carefully. Go figure. I can't play
right?
for shit, and so like,
yeah, man.
So so that's just never as good. But the piano roll, on the other hand, equalizes everything for me. And so again, just seeing that half step connection and going, okay, that's how tendencies work within a scale. If all I had were fa and mi and ti and do to work with as just my 4 notes in general, what kind of creations and things could you end up making? And it's amazing to see, like, okay, we can still make melodic structures that way, depending on how you settle on any one of those given notes.
Right. That probably, I guess, fa, mi, and ti. Right. That's an 016 collection, right?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. No. Shit,
Oh,
stuff right now that I haven't done in years, so I'm not gonna answer definitively on any of that.
Right. That's
nod my head, and then someone down in the comment section will blast us later.
Yeah, I know, right? That's just whoa. Like I was just thinking. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not gonna worry about that. So it's interesting though that like these solfege patterns, they sort of like direct us in a way. They take us to certain tones. Me, like you said, me, I feel like wants to go to re. It wants to pull down in a way.
Yeah.
I feel like in the tendency of the minor scale in general wants to pull down. All of it wants to go down. Whereas like the major, you have that pull between the down. Fa wants to go down and ti wants to ascend.
Right.
And you start to get to these other forms of it. Like the harmonic and melodic minor scales. So in harmonic minor, you get that sort of this weird push and pull in the wrong place, or like with like the wrong sound. to me, it creates this really sort of like loss, longing kind of sound. I guess harkening back to that sort of doctrine of affects kind of idea of just this like, it's so just sad. I feel like,
Yeah, and especially you're saying minor has that feel of going down. It's like that
Yeah.
interval of longing is the descending half step type of feel, and that's why a lot of times that scale gets used. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
The mixing of those things, you get to melodic minor is interesting. That like the way to produce like the actual like rising kind of feeling of stuff is to make it major, essentially.
Yeah, right.
Major scale, but was still that minor third. And so, yeah, interesting bit of again of tendencies.
Right. So I've been asking my students to basically sing these scales. Like one of the things they have to do, which they should be doing. So they definitely should have an idea of what these things sound like. At this point. So.
Yeah, right, Vernon? Are you learning?
Oh man, I wish there was a kid named Vernon in my class. That would be amazing.
Unfortunately, I have a student named Vernon, and I just picked one at random. So if he's watching this, I'm not talking to you. I pulled
sorry, Vernon.
Kyle's my normal guy, but I figured we all have a student named Kyle. So
yeah, right. Okay, so I'm gonna refer to my notes here for a second. With harmony, we have that sort of like basic triad. I've been having my students arpeggiate a one chord essentially, right? Do, mi, and so.
Right.
That's like a tonic triad, right? Now, one of the sort of things about these triads, right, is that they're built off of the scale degrees of harmony. We were talking a little bit earlier about tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, right? Dominant. Submediant, leading tone, tonic. There we go. Sort of had a subdominant moment. I was like, "Whoa, is it subdominant and predominant?" But so we have these names, right? And we can essentially build triads off of each of these scale degrees, right? So once we've learned how to arpeggiate these chords, we can basically do that with every note in the sort of scale, in the major scale, and definitely in the minor scales as well. Now, these tendencies, right, they sort of exist in these harmonies that come out of these scales, right? So the very first thing we have to talk about, and sort of the most important, I think, tendency of all of these is that the triad built on Do sort of acts as like a home, right? It is the starting, right? It is the starting point, and that triad supports this idea of like home. And I don't really have any other words to describe that sort of that feeling.
It's the sun of the solar system. At least when I teach it, that's how I think about it. Like that's our gravitational pull that we kind of every other chord or every other note has a certain revolution, and sometimes those orbits, revolution's not the word. They have certain orbits. Sometimes orbits cross each other, and that's where like functions might change on particular things. But at the end of the day, they all gravitate towards that, or around that one center, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah. So yeah, that's the sun. I like that. That tonic chord, that tonic triad. That is our sun. And everything else just orbits around that point. That's a great way of thinking about it.
But colors everything else too, because I mean, like having that one tonic chord, it's just the presence of that tonic chord itself gives everything else. It's. I mean, the half steps and everything, that they're built off of really kind of go into it. But like that tonic chord is what gives everything else the function.
Right. Now, I am kind of curious. Do you have a system sort of set up of like how the chords orbit around the sun?
Not necessarily, but I tend to think about it like in terms of like once I have like my tonic chord, my sun, I then think of
Yeah.
like what's the dominant sort of thing that's running around.
Right.
And there's
Right.
a planet that like comes in kind of closest amount of orbit. That's like the strongest gravitational like moment. And you and I were talking before you actually hit record. I was kind of saying that sometimes I don't think of things in terms of just chords. I don't always start with chords. I think of things from a melodic point of view. And
Yeah.
the
Right.
reason I do that is because I think typically, like, just because a chord might be built off of a certain scale degree doesn't mean that that chord is taking on that scale degree's tendency. All right. Like,
Right.
fa
Right.
doesn't necessarily want to lead down to me if we're talking a 4 chord going to a 3 chord. Right.
Right.
But the particular fa pitch still wants to lead down to like a mi pitch, or the T pitch wants to lead up to a do pitch somewhere. And so I start to think of like different chords as having different like size of like your dominant chord being something that just ultimately feels it's got the dominant pitch and the leading tone pitch, and so its gravitational pull is strongest towards that sun. Or like fa has or the 4 chord has fa in there, but it maybe wants to also kind of lead to other places, or sometimes it wants to come back to tonic. I'm saying that was one that like is situational. Sometimes it's a predominant chord, sometimes it acts as like a means of prolonging the tonic, in some sense. And
Right.
so,
Right.
And
So
yeah, I tend to think about it more in terms of what's actually building up the chord, kind of looking.
no, that makes sense. That makes sense. So okay, I really like this concept though of like how the different harmonies kind of like move around the sun, and
Right.
they sort of just orbit this like one harmony, and sometimes they, like you said, they intersect with one another.
Right.
Because so the way that I always approach harmony is that we set up, there are 3 types of harmony, right? There is tonic, right? There is predominant, and then there is dominant, right? Tonic, predominant, dominant. And these different motions, or these different harmonies, they sort of all move in a certain way to one another, right? I have like a fancy little chart that I hand out to my students about like tonics always move to one of these things, right? And one of these things always moves to one of these things, and always moves to one of these things, so on and so forth, right? And you get this like circular motion of stuff, right? So, in a way, it's like I see how we can relate this idea of like an orbit of harmony, because like again, everything seems to be based off of this tonic triad, right? Do, mi, and so, or 1, 3, and 5, right? So I think that there are certain types of harmonies that are more prevalent than others,
Right.
For instance, like a tonic triad, right? That is extremely important, right? Because that is home base, that is your sun, right? And we can see that these other harmonies that exist kind of around this tonic triad, right? We can kind of like lead to them in certain ways,
Right.
So I think that first off, the predominant and dominant triads are also really important to talk about.
Sure.
We have a tonic triad that's built off of do, mi, and so, right? A triad is 1, 3, and 5 in this sense, but one collection of 3 notes, right? So you get like a chord, right? Now, we can apply the same idea to the 4 and the 5 of our major scale, right? So in these two chords, they both sort of lay out predominant and dominant functions, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting that we get fa and so, right? So if we take a triad based on fa, the intervals we get are fa, la, and do.
Right.
Right. So inside of that 4 chord, we get a tonic note, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Which I think, I don't know, I think that's really important, right? And one thing that you said earlier is that, 4 can kind of also, it's kind of like 1 sometimes, and like, it's also a perfect interval, right? From the 1, right? It's a perfect 4th away from 1. So, the 4th, the interval of a 4th inherently has no quality, right? So it sort of kind of stands to reason that it exists in a slightly kind of limbo place. It doesn't really have a draw. It can kind of go back to 1, right? Or it can go to somewhere else,
Well, so like thinking about tendency tones for a moment. So fa itself being a tendency tone maybe wants to lead down to mi. And so when you have a 4 chord, predominant chord, if it's not actually functioning as predominant, right? Like that fa wants to tend to move back down to mi. But where I think it works really well as a predominant chord is actually it's because you have do in the chord. And do is going to briefly move down to T when you go to your 5 chord, right? When you go to the dominant. And then
right.
He wants to come straight on back to do. And so if you're thinking about the chord in terms of its functionality, it's like taking those individual pitches and going, okay, here's, if it's acting like as some sort of prolongation of the tonic, it's like we're making use of just holding on to the tonic pitch so we hear it is really important. And then we're playing off of fa going to mi. Well, when fa moves to mi, you keep your tonic pitch, keep do in place. Well, now you've created a 1 chord, essentially.
Right.
And so I tend to then break down chords down to like, what are the absolutely functional notes within a chord or functional pitches? Because triads, what's actually kind of interesting about them, it's like we have 3 pitches, but you don't need all 3 pitches at any given moment to ever really have that particular harmony being implied or played, right?
Right.
So for your tonic triad, what are the 2 pitches you really need? We just need do and you need mi, right? For your really it's your fa chord. Honestly, I think having your 4 chord. We're throwing all this shit back and forth.
Right. It's a fa chord,
Yeah, you got your fa and your do are really the two operative notes. I mean, you kind of want to have la somewhere in there to kind of help give it its quality, but I think it's really going to be what are you going to do between fa and do that's going to really kind of operatively make this chord do what it needs to do. When you get to your dominant chord, I mean, having your dominant pitch and then having your 7th scale degree leading tone, those are going to be really important to have for any of those. So thinking about with any particular chord and its function, it's like you're looking for notes that have potential for tendencies. When you move from one chord to the next, what things might move by half step, what things might move like in its closest connection, and that's going to give you that pull. Because when you think about really like what's making predominant move to your dominant and then what's making dominant move back, I mean, that's all we're literally doing is just like those little half steps are turning, and that's another way of visualizing it for me. I just think about like, all right, what was low is now going to move up, what was high is now going to move down, and it's just turning the half steps from one chord to the next.
Right.
That's at least how I visualize it. And so again, kind of looking at those triads, it's like we have the 1, the 3, and the 5. We do have the 4, 6, 1, and 5, 7, and 2. But within each of those, like, what do those pitches really want to do at any given moment? And it's always situational. It's like your 5 chord. Again, you still move to tonic functions even when you don't go back to a 1 chord, even when you go back to your 6 chord, for instance, right? You're still going back to a tonic functioning chord because you're still going back to do and mi, right? Or
right.
Moving to like a 3 chord and everything. I mean, still having mi available is really important on there.
I think you're absolutely right, man. Because like so mi in a sense, right? Because in a tonic chord, mi kind of acts like T does in that dominant chord, right? That sort of that so T re chord, right?
Yeah.
So mi has this tendency in a tonic chord to want to move up to fa, right? In some capacity, it wants to go to fa. So we start to get into this idea of voice leading, right? So what you said earlier is that in terms of having a harmony, right, you need at least 2 notes to have a harmony, right? So you can have do and mi, right? And with 2 notes, you get more sounds, right? So more sounds means you sort of have more textures and a way to kind of work with at that point also. So with 2 voices, we can now start to apply rules of harmony in a way, right? We can give these sort of tendency tones more importance in a way, right? So right, one of the most pleasing ways to move chords, I think, in general, is probably in thirds, right? So if you have do and mi, right, together, and they move to re and fa, right, for instance, right? You have a major third moving to a minor third, right? That's a gorgeous sound, right? And it can be used very effectively, and we have just different ways of moving these types of harmonies, right? So, for instance, what if we had do, right, and we have a mi, right? We have do and mi, right? And instead of we want mi to move up to fa, right? Because that's what mi does best, right? It likes to move to fa, right? But do can pretty much go anywhere it wants to, right? Because it's a tonic chord, right? It can kind of go anywhere. So like, what if you move it? What if it steps down? What if it steps down to T, right? And then you get that sweet interval of T and fa.
Yeah. You get T and fa, which is really fun because that's both tendencies. It's like doubling the amount of like gravitational pull on that chord. That's like
it has to.
When you resolve that chord incorrectly, everybody feels it.
Right.
Why? People might not know why that was a dissatisfactory, resolution, but they feel it because those tendencies just don't happen. You set up that expectation and then fail to deliver.
Right. It is one of the most like displeasing feelings. It's like no one wants to be there. Just in a very just a poorly resolved chord. It's just.
And we've all written it, and we've all written it, and then just like mentally justified this action as like an artistic decision that
Right. Oh man.
You have to understand the mode, man. That's just the mode.
It's just the way the mode worked out. I was feeling it. It just because we are unresolved beings.
You don't get my concept.
It's art, bro. You just don't get it.
There it is. That's what you mentioned. So you mentioned fa and T, and so fa and T now opens up the possibility of a different type of dominant chord. Now we're kind of dealing with really just the triad built off of the 7, and so simple diminished triad, and then fa and T's resolution gets you like almost a stronger resolution than so and T would give. Even though fa and T just by themselves aren't explicitly the dominant triad,
Right.
Interesting. Which, whenever you learn about it, your dominant triad, one of the first like ways of souping up that chord and giving it just a little bit extra beef is to add fa to the mix. So we have, what is that? So, T, re, and fa. Making it a dominant 7th type of sound. And in essence, all we're doing, and this is again kind of thinking about shapes. You're a jazz bass player, or you're bass player. I don't know if jazz bassist is the thing that you define yourself as, but I see you as one. I tend to think of just like chords as, especially large stacks of chords. All it is just different triad settings on top of each other. And so when we get a dominant 7th chord, it literally is just a dominant triad with like your leading tone triad just kind of
stacked.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You just sort of like, they just exist like this,
Yeah. Basically. Or I guess really in this case, I guess it is. Yeah, it is there.
Right. We
This, by the way, this is how we're going to identify ourselves in public. music theorists.
How do I
like?
how do I do this? Whoa, there we go. Ah,
It's
no,
the
3.
nerdiest gang sign that we've ever come up with.
Whatever. I'll figure it out later.
East side dominance, man.
Right. So, that was a concept actually that sort of blew my mind the first time I learned about it. That the diminished 7 chord was kind of the same. It's just part of a 5 chord, right? It just is like an extra. I like what you just said. It's just sort of like tacked on there, like stapled to it.
That's all it is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just and it really makes like tonal harmony easy to think about once you just start to understand that all these harmonies that we talk about are just they're stacks of thirds, just interlocking stacks of thirds, and that's probably the easiest way I think just to think about them.
Oh, yeah.
And like they all sort of have their own tendencies, right? If we think about each note that appears as like a specific voice, right? If it's a 3-note chord, it's a triad, right? 3 voices. But if it's a 4-note chord, right, you can do a lot more with that. I think one of the coolest things about like just Western harmony is that like it was 4 independent voices that sort of like, created the bigger like whole, right? And it was like 4 melodies sort of like smashed together in a way, 4 things that could be independent and like played with like a harmony instrument or something, but like 4 distinct melodies all together making the greater whole. That was like a really cool concept, and that like led to this creation of like harmonic thought, how like whenever you like smash these melodies together, they kind of sound a certain way, like certain sounds draw our ear into a certain places. Yeah. So these triads, once we start like adding notes to them, we basically just start adding thirds to a triad, So 7th chords, right? We just talked about the dominant 7th chord, right? So if we take the dominant note of our major scale, right, we build a triad on it. We get so, ti, and re, right?
Right.
And then we add basically another third, right? Or we think of the triad based on ti, right? Because ti is the 2nd note of that triad, right? So the triad built on ti, ti, re, and then fa, right?
Yeah.
So we get that tendency tone, right? We talked about that way back at the beginning, right? Fa is that tendency tone, right?
Right. Yeah.
It has a tendency to want to go down to mi. So like we get this chord with just this nasty tension, and it's so amazing.
The amazingness on that is the fact that it works so well, and it's managed. Like we haven't really found a better system than that.
Yeah, right.
And it's hundreds of years later.
Exactly.
That's what's kind of interesting. Like, I do a lot more like pop music now than I do classical music for sure.
Yeah.
Just being an electric guitarist. But one of the things I've gotten really into lately has been a lot more like gospel playing, and it's amazing just the use of just dominant like 7th type chords or just these dominant structures. Even in that music, which to me, when I first started getting into it, I felt like I was stepping into an upper level music theory class, just chords being substituted out for other chords and just like superimposing this on top of there. And like, we don't call these moves. These are progressions. We call them moves. We're moving from here to here. And it's like, oh, that's so weird. Then I like take a look at it and it's like, oh, all we're doing is just taking the same basic, function of like, this is a dominant function resolving to like kind of a tonic function in that moment.
Right.
Just extrapolating just within huge progressions, just different areas of tonic, dominant tonic,
yeah. Right. So those tonic and dominant relationships, I think that's a really important thing to understand when you're talking about harmony, right?
Yeah.
Excuse me. So because right, our tonic chord contains do, mi, and so, right? It contains the tonic, the mediant, and the dominant, right? In that sort of tone center. Because it contains that dominant note, right? So, so it inherently like can go back to itself in a way, right? Because it has the dominant note, right?
Sure.
And the reason I think that so is considered a dominant sort of sound is it sounds so right when you move it, when so moves up to do in like that bass motion, but because the triad itself is built to have the leading tone in it, right? So the triad itself of so, right? So sort of can go down to do or up to do, right? But like if you have so, ti, and then finally re, right? Ti and re themselves, they want to pull down to do, right? Re kind of, I feel like, wants to go down in a way in that context, right? Of so against re, right? Because they sort of want to inherently move against each other, right? I think so moving up to do, re moving down to do, right? And ti moving up to do, right? I think all of that sort of it just makes our ear want to go to that spot, you know?
Right. And it's interesting. They all kind of want to just resolve right on back to that tonic pitch again. And then, of course, if you're cool, you throw in that fa in there. Like, that's your lone guy that's just holding out and being like, I'm just going to move on down to me, you know? And what you end up getting off of that, which is cool, is like, it gives you your tonic triad feel. It gives you your color for tonic now. Because tonic,
Exactly.
it's like your 5 chord, what you just kind of outlined, of all 3 notes of your dominant triad could easily just move straight to do with no other pitch. That dominant triad can easily move to like a minor tonic chord or a major tonic chord, and just that triad by itself just offers like, I mean, it's no real solace in terms of like which one we're going to. You just kind of have to kind of decide which one of those notes is going to move on up to the third.
Yeah.
But it's what I like about it. It sets up the possibility of just like this very fluid or kind of ambiguous like one. We know we're back on tonic, and because we're talking about major scale harmony, I think our ear just automatically fills in for us that third. And of course, also just based on the overtone spectrum, I think hear that third subconsciously, even if we don't hear it.
Well, so I think that's interesting because, for instance, if I just play a perfect fifth, I inherently want it to be a minor chord.
Really?
Like I want that pull. I don't know. It's interesting.
That is super interesting to me because I almost hear it exactly the opposite. Where I think if I hear perfect fifth, my ear almost naturally just like throws in the third somewhere, major third.
Yeah.
That's weird. What sort of weird conditioning did you have as a?
Yeah, I know, right? I don't know. I really got into music through rock and roll, so I blame like Primus and like System of a Down. Whoops.
It's kind of like, if you're thinking Primus, then I hit that perfect fifth, and what my ear naturally wants to do is throw a tritone in there somewhere.
Yeah, I know, right?
Somebody like just slapping the back of a whale or something.
Exactly. Yeah, talking about Jerry, his race car.
All this is just kind of interesting, though. Just the way we tend to like think about just movement of pitches. It goes back to the idea, like we're talking triadic movement, but I think so much of this, can easily just be talked about from purely a melodic standpoint, Even if you had a single voice, that's, I think, why melody is kind of one of the things we all naturally gravitate towards anyways, and a lot of times, like, just a single melody, I think just inherently, it elicits, a lot of these kind of tendency tone expectations. It kind of throws out all of these possibilities for harmonies, even if they're not there. we just hear this single melody kind of moving, right? Our ears maybe naturally add in certain sounds and certain things. And that might not be exactly what the composer had in mind. Maybe once the composer adds a second voice to it, now a whole new set of relationships happen. And that's why I was thinking tendency tones themselves or individual notes in a chord. I mean, it's all situational depending on like what came before it, to where, it's not really until you have melodic movement that, I keep coming back to this like predominant or subdominant chord, the four chord thing. Its function really is determined by what happened before it, and it's what happens next is, always in terms of like what precedes your subdominant chord. Are you preceding it with a one chord with the third in the bass, which produces like a tendency to move up, which forces your ear to want to hear it continue an upward motion to five? Or do you hear it as like, do is in the bass and we hear it, wanting to kind of move back down to the tonic chord kind of thing.
Right. So I mean that kind of brings us into this idea of like function of these different tones and like and the function that they have in different voices, right? So when we're talking about just Western harmony in general, we usually get four voices to work with, right?
Right.
We sort of call that the bass, the tenor, the alto, and the soprano from lowest to highest, right? For anyone that's been in choir, I'm sure they're familiar with these voices, sort of bass is your lowest voice, right? Tenor is your mid-low, alto is your mid-high, and then soprano is your high, right? So you have those four voices. Now, when we're talking about harmony, right, we really want to consider harmony as if each voice part was singing one note of this chord, right? Mm-hmm. So if we have four voices in a chord, to make a chord, we need the root of a chord, right? The third of a chord, the fifth of the chord, and then essentially any of those notes can be doubled, or we can add the seventh of the chord.
Right,
and that could change depending on, or some other kind of like color tone, that can change depending on like your style, right? Now in the sort of common practice theory, usually we sort of start with just doubling our tonic pitch, right? Do. So in this sort of sense, we can structure a chord as like maybe say do, so, mi, do, right? Have a nice wide spaced chord, right? Once you sort of can hear these intervals kind of like, maybe not all at once, but it's like you can imagine how far each of these things are sort of, by audiating them in your head. I've actually started doing this thing with my students now. I'm having them go to Theoria, right? And do those exercises, just like identify the scale, right? Eventually it's going to be identify these intervals and just, hey, heads up students, you're going to have a lot of stuff ahead of you. Sorry. So
last week's.
Yeah, right. No, but so once you get an idea of like what these intervals sound like, then you can get an idea of these different sort of like what we call voicings for chords, how to space them, right? But really a lot of it just comes from just like playing them, like play the chord, play it on a piano or a guitar, or like even just like on your MIDI controller, set it up in your DAW, and there are so many ways to go about this in sort of like modern music making, but once we establish this like tonic triad, right? The do, the mi, and the so, right? And we get that final voice do. We have to consider sort of where all of those voices can or want to move to,
Yeah.
Again, I feel like mi tends to want to go to fa in some respect, right? So where we voice that chord, it really sort of matters, or where we voice that note in the chord. Now, the cool thing about these triads is that even in a four voice structure, it's still a triad.
Yeah.
Right. Because we only have three notes, right? If we're doubling just one of those notes, still only.
Yeah.
Sorry.
3 unique pitch names, right?
Exactly. Right. There's 3 unique note names in that triad, right? So we just sort of have to consider where each of those notes wants to move, And do can kind of move anywhere. You know, it can really go to any pitch.
Right.
I feel like mi wants to go to fa, and so in most respects, so wants to go to do, right? But it also can kind of just like step up or step down, you know? Uh, it can want to go to la or fa, you know, like why not? And sort of where all of these different voices move to, that sort of dictates how your harmonic progression kind of unfolds, right? And there are tons of rules about how to move harmony, you know. uh, I think that it's best to think of them in terms of voices, right, and voice leading.
Sure. Yeah.
So that way we sort of keep the tendency between, you know, all of these different tones. uh, Now, one thing that I always thought was really interesting about harmony was figuring out like your baseline, you know. Now I'm sure a lot, like all the producers of my class, they can relate to, like, you know, a dope baseline, man, that can go so far, right? And then like the harmony that you do on top of that, you know, that can be, once you understand the principles of harmony, right? It's like that can like almost be anything, you know,
Yeah.
once you have that sweet baseline, right? Uh, so one of the one of the things that I've been thinking about approaching this, you know, topic, I guess, is actually talking about, you know, functional harmony and like just some common baselines. You know, if we're starting at one, right, then a common baseline from there is the, you know, 6 2 5, right?
Yeah.
We don't even go to 4 in that context, right? But it's a really commonly known chord progression, actually, that 1 6 2 5 or even 1 6 4 5, right?
Right.
So, you know, we start to give all of these tones of that initial major scale a function now, right? All of these tones have a function when they appear in our baseline, right? And where our baseline moves sort of dictates how we perceive the function of each of those chords.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think the bass line is extremely important. I'm also a bass player, right? I think that where the bass line moves, you know, that dictates so much about how the harmony like just sounds and just feels overall.
I 1,000% agree on that one. I tend to teach, so I tend to teach things from like a two voice perspective almost always. Even when I'm just directing an ensemble, I try to make the ensemble make sure that they're constantly aware of what's happening in your outer voices, what's happening on the top voice, which is typically the melody that we all hear, you know, kind of stand out the most as being kind of like the tune, maybe, the vocal line or whatever. And then I say like the bass line. And you have to know what the bass player is doing, kind of listening to that, because the bass player is essentially laying out all of your functions, or at least laying out like, again, the perception of function in there.
Right.
In a pop music standpoint, you know, like you obviously things have their exceptions all over the place, but yeah, that bass line and the functionality of that is just I don't know. You have to be able to write a good bass line. Your bass line needs to be every bit as catchy and cool as whatever happening in the soprano line, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's something about those extreme voices, you know, like the extremes are like really important in like any given harmony, you know, and like when you're sort of thinking about harmony, also, you know, we tend to when I'm thinking, like when I was taught, I guess, how to think about all these things, I was taught from like a standpoint of thinking about it melodically, you know, and so singing it was really important, right? So being able to sing like a bass line that I was playing, or sing like a vocal line, or sing melodies in my sight singing classes, you know, and being able to put them together with other students, right? I think that those experiences were extremely important in understanding this concept of harmony, right? And something that I am really trying to figure out is how to get my class to feel what it's like to move in harmony with somebody, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know quite know what to do yet.
I still feel so much of that just really depends so much on just getting individual voices to move in the directions they need to move. Individual lines. To me, it's kind of where it comes back to. I mean, you can think about it in terms of moving in harmony, but I don't know. When I think about it, how I actually listen to music and perceive music, it's almost never from a vertical standpoint. I think at any given moment, I may be thinking, oh, that's a cool chord or that's a cool sound. But that cool chord or that cool sound is only cool because of the context that everything before or afterwards has put it in,
Right.
Jumping way ahead in the theory textbook here, if we start adding in things like Neapolitan chords or like the, augmented sixth type chords, they're only as useful as what happens before and afterwards, and that sort of thing. And so when it comes to like singing in harmony or playing in harmony, I think it always has to be driven by the melodic element. What are you doing, with your actual voice that you're singing? And especially if you're singing it, I mean, it's just singing it with confidence,
Right.
Not relying on everybody else around you to try to sing your voice. You have to know exactly where your voice is, what that note is that you're supposed to sing, make sure it's, mostly in tune. And then when you hear everyone else around you, then you can kind of contextualize it a little bit better.
Yeah, man, that's one of the struggles right now also, is that like, not everyone has like a keyboard instrument that they can utilize, or like a guitar or something, so I've been like pointing students to online resources. It's like, okay, use like there's like ways to make your QWERTY keyboard into like this sort of keyboard, and like you can at least get pitch, right? And so it's like at least like check your pitch and stuff, so
there's a book that when I was trying to get into graduate studies, again, I think I mentioned to you, I just got really into Hindemith for a while. Elementary Training for Musicians. If you've never had the opportunity to find yourself to feel very inadequate, 3 chapters in and a book, labeled elementary training, that's the one right there. And what I like about it is there's a ton of exercises that's all about just good independent work. So something that's kind of typical of that book might be taking something like a melody that you already know. Take a children's tune. Take like Frere Jacques or Row Your Boat, or like Mary Had a Little Lamb or something. And literally like play one voice on the piano while singing a different voice, kind of in connection with it. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying it in front of you.
Oh,
right?
man, no.
But the idea here is that you're, if you're wanting them to really kind of get a good idea for singing in harmony with one another, I mean, it's just, you've got one melody that you're playing that's fixed, and you can hear it as fixed. Its tuning is not going to be variable, hopefully.
Right.
It's in tune. And then you're singing, maybe coming up with your own bass line, coming up with your own kind of melody underneath. Maybe not even thinking about it like it's a bass line, just thinking about it like it's just a second melody. It's 2 voices. Obviously, one's going to be higher than the other. And so kind of coming from that approach, singing it, and again, I almost always try to make students sing through solfege, because solfege to me is just always just, I see it as functionality. Even though it might not necessarily always translate to everybody's function. But if I think fa, I know fa goes to me in terms of tendencies. I just understand it better that way. But if I'm playing a melody out on the keyboard and then singing my newly composed bass line, or vice versa, playing my newly composed bass line but singing the tune I already know, really well, that can often really get your ears just really adjusted to those vertical harmonies, but then also hearing the tendencies just within the horizontal movement of the melody. You start to intuit like directions for melodies after just the experience of hearing what melodies can do, along one another, right? And so forcing yourself to just, as a individual, do 2 voice things, that's always, I think, beneficial. Going back to Guitarland, like thinking about like the fretboard, doing things where you're actually practicing the melody in like, on the strings 1 through 3 on guitar, for instance, and then tackling just the bass notes or bass lines in, on your top 3 strings, 4, 5, and 6. to me, that's a really great way of understanding the harmony of the tune. And all you're doing is just breaking things down to just very bare bones level things, and that's like, we're talking about creating chords and kind of starting from that standpoint. But if you think about it, maybe from like the standpoint of a lot of people when they start learning music on a formal level, like maybe at a college, maybe already had opportunities of learning how to play even just basic chord shapes, or basic things, in general. Maybe they know how to read, lead sheets, out of like the real book or something, maybe not, but some people might at least know, like, okay, I know that there's a melody there and then it says a chord on top of it. Cool. I'm going to play whatever bass note, is either the root of that chord, or if it's a slash chord, I'm going to find that, that new, bottom note. But if you really practice just getting that melody and then just playing only the bass notes, I mean, you're hearing harmonies, you're hearing function, you're hearing, in that case, not only function, but function as a melodic means and not so much function as a vertical means, right? Because at the end of the day, like, to me, it almost always goes back to just thinking melody. Because when we start thinking vertical structures, I don't know, to me, that's like amputating like things, but that's just me. I don't even know that's like probably the best way to go about it. But that's in my warped brain. That's how I drive the ship or the anchor.
Well, I mean, I
through the solar system of tones.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I had a really bizarre introduction to theory, I guess, because like when I was in high school, I took guitar lessons, at like the local H&H, and like the guitar teacher that I took bass lessons, actually, right? So I was an electric bass player. I was so proud of that, man. But I took lessons from this guitar player, right? And he was like a theory buff, and he sort of had bought this book, Music Theory for Dummies, and like had read it, and like basically taught me all these like really basic music theory concepts, like how scales worked, or like how to build scales, basically, and like half steps and whole steps. And like I had this knowledge of modes, like they just made sense, I guess. Like, so I had this really spotted like view of theory, and then like I started taking lessons at San Jack, and ended up really falling in love with just theory. And so I started taking composition lessons, and like it started me off. The teacher there just started me off as like thinking in terms of counterpoint, right? It was all just like note against note, so everything was interval based at first, and then we started to add more notes, right? And so like more voices, and so it was like more intervals to work with, and so you started to really get an idea of what notes wanted to move where, and then transitioning that into functional harmony was like a breeze, it was like, oh, well, like clearly, like if I know how to move voices, right, and I know that like they just want to move to these certain notes, like, great, this is going to be really easy, and like it just became like a giant puzzle at that point, and I don't know, I really fell in love with it, this sort of thing that you could like manipulate, and you could make it sound however you wanted, just given, especially it was like if you were just given a bass line or just given a melody, and like being able to just apply different types of harmonies to that melody, and just seeing how it sounds, and some like you can get some wild things when you just have a melody, right? And just like trying to reharmonize a melody, it's fun, man.
It's super fun. So a few things to kind of put on that. So the idea of counterpoint is interesting, because my introduction to music theory was probably the exact opposite. I went, was in band in high school, and we offered like a music theory class in my high school. I say we offered, they offered, I took. So I took 2 years of music theory there, and the approach was almost always, I'll use that term, amputated again. It's like everything is just, by itself. Here's what a 2 chord is. Here's what a 3 chord is. Here's a 4 chord. And there was almost no real sense of like functionality in there. We would do music analysis and figure out that, yeah, the dominant chord wants to resolve to a tonic chord. And then we have a 4 chord. the 4 chord's called a subdominant chord, and a lot of times it precedes your 5 chord, you know, and it's like, we went through those, but we never really talked about it in terms of like, these are standard practices, and these are standard practices based off of years and years and years of people writing melodies, you know, against one another. And honestly, like that type of thinking carried through all through my undergraduate stuff, which I feel like my undergrad years, if I'm looking back on, I'm like I maybe wasn't ready, like mentally. I was, obviously, and I graduated and did fine, but my mindset was just so like based on like this one vertical structure. I'd study chords and be like, oh, cool. Now we have breaking out of tertian harmony, breaking out of chords based on thirds. I get into chords based on fourths or stacks of seconds, and I go, okay, this one chord is cool. And I almost never concerned myself with proper voice leading, counterpoint and structure or anything, even functionality. I was just like, any chord can function as anything. It depends on what you feel that day, you know? And it wasn't until I took 2 years off to get into grad school. And under that time, I don't know what it was. I think I like picked up this like biography on Nadia Boulanger, and just realizing how much she taught about like, you know, just counterpoint. I go, okay, counterpoint needs to be a thing I absorb. I spent 2 years just absolutely just any text or anything I could find, I just went into it. And it really wasn't until I was studying 16th century counterpoint. That is where I really started to get a good foundational idea for voice leading practices, even functional harmony, even though 16th century counterpoint has very little or nothing to do with what we think of today as functional harmony. You know, it's like the idea of tendencies, the idea of like tension and release, and above all, the idea of voices moving in harmony. You know, and it's funny because we call it counterpoint, which is essentially point to point, note to note, right? But counterpoint is so much more than that. It's really melody against melody. Whereas like my old composition teacher, first composition teacher I had, just said it's two melodies that sound bitchin' together.
Yeah, right.
And you know, it's like thinking about it on those lines, like they have to make sense melodically in order for it to really make sense harmonically, if that makes sense. Like if the melody itself is just this jacked up organization of this, like this pitch can go up here, and for lack of better things, this one's going down here, and I'm just going to throw it here. If there's no real sense of linear connection from one to the next, to me, that's going to throw your harmonies off completely. I mean, you can have a 1 chord going to a 4 chord going to a 5 chord, but when they're all mixed up like that, those chords are not going to have that same type of like real sense of like togetherness and movement. They're going to feel like just, all right, that's a 1 chord on a test. Hear this next chord. What is it? That sounds like a 4 chord. Okay. Like, and it's, again, it's the idea of just amputating something. It's just, it's disembodied chords, you know? And it's that melodic movement that if you can like pen and craft a really fantastic melody, you know, and then go underneath it, and man, even if you don't know what your functions are at this point, come up with another melody that sounds cool about it. Fly blind, you know, start from there. I think that's always kind of like an interesting take on this. But then when you go back and you go, okay, what are some of these rules? Okay, tendency tones, right? Like if I get to my 7th, you know, that leading tone, where am I taking it? Am I descending through a line so it makes sense for 7 to go down to 6? Cool. Am I doing any line in which the 7th is just present? Probably needs to go back up to 1 somewhere, right? If you get, you know, onto that 4, depending on your direction, does that 4 want to actually move down to 3, or are you coming from 3, so 4 actually now wants to go to 5, you know? And so, like, if you can find, like, it's almost like riffs, you know, to be honest with you. If you find, like, these very specific connections that happen, they're like cliches, little cliche patterns in melodies that whenever you see mi to fa, so is probably going to be next. Or whenever you see do going down to la, it's a huge chance that fa is going to be next. So that's like, you know, do, la, fa. So, you know, you hear that connection and like, that's a riff. learn that riff. We all fucking know how to play Iron Man. You know, we all know
yeah, right.
Smoke on the Water. And so I think when you're learning harmony, man, you really need to know, you know, do, mi, fa, so. You need to know that riff, right? Because that riff is going to present certain tendencies in which other melodies on top are going to be able to you know, structure against or lay against nicely.
Yeah.
But it's all melodic patterns and melodic shapes, which then goes straight on back to thinking about the fretboard going across. You know, you see these little like shapes that you make that are like, this is a melodic shape. I'm not a jazz musician. I pretend to be one a lot. I spend a lot of time practicing it. I tell my students, you know, that I'm not a jazz musician, but I'll always say we for this one.
Yeah.
You know, we practice a lot of like enclosures, you know, which is nothing more than a melodic device of having like a pitch, and then you're just literally surrounding that pitch stepwise, either above, go below, and then back to the pitch or something. But you know, we, even in improvisation, are just always working on creating melodic structures that are going to operate against any other melodic structure or any other harmonic structure. I mean, even you as a jazz bass player, I would imagine melody is probably a much bigger role in your life than just thinking. I mean, obviously we're constantly thinking. You know,
oh yeah. So I mean, you know, the whole concept of like playing against the melody is kind of like the whole point of playing jazz bass. You know, it sets up that sort of like harmonic structure. You know, like we play the important notes, right? But like how we get there like really matters. You know, and so like crafting these melodic lines against a melody that's happening. You know, or like these sort of like pseudo melodic grooves. You know, that sort of like lead into different chord changes and things. You know, it's super important as a rhythm player in general, you know, like to understand how these harmonies move and like when you should accent certain things and like what you should actually accent and whatnot, you know. It's important just to like be able to hear these things and to like know them, you know, and it comes with practice. You just have to like be exposed to it for just long enough, I guess. So, you know, voice leading clearly like has a huge impact on the way we hear harmony, and I just want to talk about a couple quick, or just, you know, some common harmony things, you know. So we definitely talked about how like you know, the dominant chord wants to go to 1, you know. So we have 3 basic functions of harmony. You know, we have a tonic, a predominant, and a dominant function.
Right.
All 3 of those. And essentially, you know, we have chords that sit inside of those harmonies, right? So our tonic harmonies are basically a 1 and a 6. And if we really look at them, they share a lot of the same tones, which is kind of why they're both tonic harmonies, right? Do, mi, so is our tonic chord, but our 6th chord is la, do, mi. Right, so they share those 2 chords, you know. So we can kind of apply this like 7th chord idea to it as well if we want to get real fancy. And then in our predominant, we get a 2 and a 4, right? And again, those share the same chords, kind of under the same principles, you know, or the same notes, right? And under our dominant, we get that 5 and our 7 triads, right? And it sort of tends to be that in Western harmonic music, right, they all kind of move to one another, right? So with these triads, right, we really get just function overall. And I guess the last thing really that I want to talk about here is, you know, these chords, they all tend to function in certain ways, right? And why do they want to move to one another? Like why can do move anywhere, right? Why does the predominant want to move to fa, right? Overall, why does it want to move to so? Sorry, why does the dominant want to move back to tonic? You know, just real quick, see if we can talk about that.
Man.
I know it's a big thing.
You for the life of me, I couldn't really give you a good reason why So ever really wants to move back to Do, other than thinking about it in terms of like an overtone spectrum. It's just that like perfect fifth kind of element, that perfect fifth, of Do up to So sounds like it's all part of the same Do structure,
Yeah.
So like in my mind, I feel like that's why those are there. That's why that one exists. Within the rest of dominant, why dominant wants to move, then it becomes other tendencies like T is in there. T wants to go back to Do, right? Within those, I start to think, okay, so again, it's just about like thinking about I'm broken record here. The melodic aspect of handling your tendency tones, right? So you were talking about super quick now, like voice leading. You're talking about like voicings in general, right? You
right.
have those pitches. So the thing that I've always taught, and the things that I've always kind of learned, and just in terms of my own practice, I found this to just be a good general rule. Don't double your tendency tones, right? Because once you double tendency tones, you've now got multiple iterations of that same tendency happening, and it just overwhelms the chord. Let's get away from my space analogy for a moment. Think about food. Nobody wants too much salt in their food. Nobody wants too much paprika in their meal. Nobody wants too much spice. And so our tendency tones are usually the more spicy notes of a word anyways. Or they're not the spicy notes. They're the notes that really kind of foundational things. We want too much, don't want too much. But once you get past like the tendency tones, the rest is all about moving them maximally smooth. What's the least amount of effort, the least amount of distance from one note to the next you can get, smallest amount of half steps in terms of moving from note to note. Like that tends to be kind of like the voice leading like principle that I don't know, it handles and serves me well pretty much. But
no, that makes sense. I know that was sort of like a loaded question. I just wanted to see how you dealt with it, because I know like I would have no answer to it.
I'm gonna squirm around a little bit, on there.
Right. It's a lot like grad school in a way, going through those like that final like audition thing. What did they call it? Not the jury. I don't remember. I don't even remember what they called it now.
Yeah,
just like all the diagnostic stuff. What did they call it at Texas State?
They're probably called the same thing everywhere. I'm like a good number of years outside of that now.
And, whatever. I'm
finding as a grown-up musician, I'm with not trying to. It sounds really bad me telling you this. Who's teaching a college class? I'm finding that I'm having to break old habits that school kind of embedded in me. And I feel habits, even though it was good education and that I learned a lot, I feel it's things that have kind of given me way more limitations than I feel I really need to have. Or, it's.
Yeah, man, I understand.
I guess I'm trying to like block out memories from grad school and undergraduate stuff, and try to keep.
There's certain things, it's like I learned a good bit of what I didn't want to do,
Yeah.
Anyway,
but what it all comes back to, though, I mean, it's I was talking about the 16th century counterpoint stuff being something that worked well for me, voice leading wise. It really kind of dawned on me, just the evolution of music theory in general kind of stemmed from we started with monophonic melodies, and then eventually we decided we're going to add a second voice to that, organum or organum or whatever, however you pronounce it. We're going to have those fifths moving kind of in concert, or eventually kind of open it up to like have some thirds, and then we'll have maybe a third voice kind of show up a little bit later, and then like, oh, we can do this with 4 voices. And then people who really tried to stretch and test the waters and see, maybe we can get 16 voices. This would be cool,
Yeah, right.
But it all stemmed from just having the one melody. And melodic principles in general, if you understand, like what makes for a good melody, what makes for a good rising and falling. Again, going straight back to the idea of the piano roll, like does the melody actually make like an aesthetically pleasing shape? Like is there balance to that? Does it seem like it actually, is it a flat line, like modern pop music, or is it like occasionally goes up a fifth? You know,
Just constantly, yeah.
is it a melody that only does this? You know, all of your melodies tend to do that. You know, like that's, you know, it's like that piano roll really kind of gives me a good visualization for like what's happening melodically. I could actually visually see it's too much of this shape. I need to vary this up. Or, you know, like that's why that chord's not working. I have one note here and it jumps up to here and then it comes way back low. And, you know, it's, oh, I can see just, you know, I'm not making good melodies. My inner voices don't make good melodies. My outer voices don't make good melodies. I can't sing them and feel proud. You know, more
right. Yeah. That's a big deal actually. Is like, yeah, if you can sing all the parts, you know, just like on your own, like chances are you've written like a good little chord progression, right?
And some parts are going to sound kind of lame just because it's not going to be as cool as maybe the other parts. But
sure.
But in terms of, when I say lame, I mean like really when I say lame, I just mean there's slightly less interesting because you're hanging out on the same note for maybe more often than you are for your, you know, upper or lower voice.
Right.
That's,
right.
You know, as a guitar player, something that's been a really fun challenge for me is going back and just playing Bach chorales, just 4-voice chorales.
Yeah.
Specifically for that reason. And I almost always start with the exact same thing. I start with learning the soprano line, learning the bass line, and handle those first, and then I'll fill in the inner voices a little bit later. And the sad truth is, like, Bach chorales just lie very poorly on a guitar.
I believe that, man. I really believe that.
Yeah, totally not meant for, I mean, even on piano, sometimes there's really challenging and difficult, but it's, you know, because it's singing, it's meant for voices. On a lot of this. You got a lot of voices that are stretched really far apart, and, you know.
We used to, in my orchestra class in undergrad, would like play Bach chorales as like warm-ups and like just use them as tuning exercises, you know, just in the strings. It was actually like a great exercise, just difficult, man, to really play in tune, you know.
Like, it's, you know, they're difficult to play in tune, and I hate, like, again, it's broken record stuff, but I feel so much of the tuning issues that we have is because we're just not thinking about our particular line as,
I agree,
as an independent line. We're thinking about it always of like, where do I fit within the chord? And, you know, Bach was thinking about it both ways for sure, linearly and vertically. But, you know, it's still very much, you know, like, you got to confidently play the melody that's there, you know, and if that's not confident and you don't really fully understand the actual curve of that line that you're playing,
right,
fitting it here is going to be really challenging too. You know,
if
you're on one of those tendency chords that's on an inner voice somewhere, knowing that you were resolving that chord, knowing that that's what your function is at that point, hearing that weight that you give that chord or you give that note, you know, I think that's, you know, that's key. And again, going back to my guitar stuff, I mean, once I get my soprano and bass voices learned, I'll do soprano and tenor voice together, just the soprano and the alto voice together. I'll play just the inner voices, but I take it, so I'm always just kind of going back and forth in hearing, like, one of the best melodists ever, you know, I'm hearing his examples of melodies sounding good next to each other. And those melodies sounding really good next to each other contain all of the foundations of how good voices, you know, move, or how good chords move. You know, there's a reason we all go back to Bach's music. You know, it's not because, you know, it's not because we just say so. You know, it's like, that shit's actually really good.
Right, like it matters for a reason, you know. Anyway, so I guess we kind of definitely need to wrap it up here a little bit.
Like 4 hours now, somewhere.
Yeah, something like that, right? Hitting those Joe Rogan levels, maybe one day, man.
Yeah, dude. Have you done music theory on DMT yet?
Whoa, yeah, right.
Yeah, have you?
Have you analyzed? Oh, that's cool, man. Have you done that on DMT yet? Oh man, good old Joe Rogan. So I'm gonna go ahead and I guess end the YouTube video or YouTube stream on that.
Sure.